Well, welcome again to Research Action Research number 1, and it's a joy to be helping you through this process of your education. And in this week, we're going to cover qualitative methodology, the difference between quantity and quality. You may be looking at now your own strengths and weaknesses as it relates to research methods. And some of you, as I've said before in previous lectures, may come to grips with the quantitative methodology as the design set that you would like to do. And that's totally acceptable. Just realize in qualitative designs, you have to get a big sample and begin to dissect that sample out and observe what's going on with that data set. You're also going to use a pre-existing valid instrument that's already been tested before and proves to be a valid instrument for your particular research area that you're wanting to explore. Now, the difference between quantitative and qualitative is this. In qualitative, you design the instrument, and largely it comes through interview questions. Not all the time, but we'll get to that in the next few slides as we expand here. So qualitative methodology is looking at the data from the expression of words. How do those within your sample population begin to explain themselves? What do they describe their situation as? How do they see themselves? What's their perspective? And so you use an instrument called interviews that you've designed, and you do some field tests to test whether they are going to be good field questions that you're going to conduct in the interview process. And you need to walk through those operational standards with your mentor as to safeguard the validity of your research. But data is expressed in words and not merely in numbers. And that doesn't mean you can't use numbers in qualitative. You can. We often are looking for average age of your sample population. We can look at that through mode or mean and express those out. We also look at how many times maybe a word is used in a particular interview. That becomes helpful. So if someone uses the word, I feel good, you begin to describe those nodes in descriptive terms. Now, what we also want to look at in terms of qualitative methodology is this is where your sample population begins to express their worldview. And everyone has a personal reality and that has shaped them and how they see life. And so you go and into their particular environment and sit where they're at and begin to observe what they are talking about. So again, your interview questions will help serve as that test. Now, when we think about qualitative methodology, we're looking at the field research you're doing. In the weeks to come, we'll look at ethnography, that this is a legitimate way to go about studying a particular people group, cultural group. One particular fascinating study that I read a while back ago was a man who I'm acquainted with who lived amongst the homeless community in Los Angeles, California. And he observed one particular person for over a year and went in underground to find the informants within the homeless population of LA. So it's observing, and you can study it from an ethnographical example or ethnography. You can look at it just through case studies. You look at one particular population zone or an organization, and so you could do case study analysis there. Again, most of you probably will go the route of interviews through any of the different, whether it's grounded theory, ethnography, case study, and phenomenological research as well. And again, what you're doing is you're putting together the instrument, and you're going to test it out as a way to show the valid instrument or its validity. And of course, there's historical comparative analysis that a lot of individuals in the humanities section of field of research, humanities-based research, is where they explore more the lit review. While we will do that in chapter 2, those in the humanities-based spend a lot of time looking at the different literature bases and then reporting that in chapter 4, explaining it in a deeper way. Now, there are theory parts when we talk about concepts. What are the concepts that your sample population is giving back to you? These become what we call cluster or nodes, that through software and the extraction from that software, you begin to see the fuller treatment of the design that you chose. And so depending on what they're saying, you're building out these tree clusters from the software. And that's what you do. A second tier of that is really the primary tier, is that you, in Chapter 4, express back direct statements of your sample population. So again, if you're looking at a size of your population, and then you segment them out into particular generations or age groups or whatever the variables are, you explain in those details, so-and-so said this in regards to interview question number 1, interview question number 2, and so on. And again, your mentor should help you walk through the qualitative design methodology, and hopefully some of your other books that you'll be reading in some of your courses will then even clarify what cluster sampling is and how do you collect these clusters together and classify them in what we call the ideal types. This is going to be important as you set parameters around your themes that you're gathering. It also looks at assumptions and that people make. Your own personal bias needs to be clearly expressed if you're studying an area that's close to you, a group, or in some cases case studies, or a topic that is near and dear to your heart that you're already familiar with. And so you come with some preconceived assumptions and a bias, and so you'll want to ensure that that's clearly stated in Chapter 3. Also in qualitative design, you're looking at typology, things representing other things. In biblical education, especially in hermeneutics, we talk about typology or types of Christ. What can we see in terms of images that connect to the fuller treatment of who Jesus is? And similarly here, as we think about qualitative design, we're looking at typologies, what represents another stem or idea. Or the classification of taxonomies also comes into play. We also find relationships in qualitative design. You'll spend some time there looking at how people see things and how they arrive at meaning and working through those meaning through those concepts. Now, the measurement process is also rather unique as we explore this methodology. In quantitative, it's deductive. So you're, again, arriving at what the numbers say to arrive at the meaning of your population or your sample group. Qualitative is looking inductively. We're looking at meaning from the words that are harvested from your interviews or your focus groups that you're interviewing, and you're collecting that and you're analyzing, again, the words, the phrases, the ideas that flow from the interviews that you've conducted. It looks at concepts, and now both methodologies look at concepts and they look at the operation that is taking place in the research. And so you're going to need to spend some quality time in making sure that your methodology and your steps that you employ in both methodologies are clearly expressed out. What you intend to do and what you intend not to do in terms of your subjects of your delimitations or the limitations of your research need to be clearly and precise. Your committees that will look at your writing will probably hold you to that and make sure that you clearly state what you're going to do is what you're going to do. That's the clarity of bringing about in your dissertation. So you want to think about your steps. Thinking about the process of your methodology is important as you move through it. And so what are the key characteristics that make up the qualitative design? Why researchers conduct qualitative studies is important for you to think through. What's required? What am I going to need in terms of to undertake? What's the size of my population? How far will I go with this qualitative design methodology? Am I going to stay within my geographical region? So again, how far will I go to conduct the interviews? And then how do researchers design a qualitative study is also part of this process as well. And then lastly, what topics should be addressed as I think about the qualitative design methodology. So let's try to answer some of this as best as we can. So qualitative research begins with assumption. Again, it's a worldview. We look at the possible use of a theoretical lens, is how someone looks at it from their particular glasses. And so you begin to arrive at some research questions, and eventually turns into the problem statement of how this particular individual or focus group or what is really the emergent theme that rises up that becomes the centralized problem statement within your dissertation. So these are the characteristics of a qualitative research. And so you're collecting the data and you're doing it in a natural setting, and you're observing the person that has volunteered to be part of your sample, part of your interview process, and you're observing both their reaction and also what they say is going to be important as part of your data analysis. And so you go into that analysis phase realizing that it's an inductive method, looking at words and themes that will arrive from, will emerge from the interviews as you work through this method, which is a valid way to go about your research. And actually, I would encourage you to think about a qualitative design, especially if you're concerned about getting the dissertation completed. Often find that while qualitative is very difficult to do, it's also easily managed if you formulate your steps in the appropriate way. And if you would like further information on that, feel free to give me a call. I'd love to spend some time with you outside of this course to help you along the way. So we're looking at patterns, we're looking at themes, we're trying to arrive at meaning. We're going to do this in a natural setting. We may pick an office where we do it. We might pick a classroom where we sit with an individual. We could do a park, depending on the who of our subject area. We're going to look at multiple sources for our data, interviews, documents, observations that we might occur. Going back to the natural study, it's important that we go to where the population is at. And so if it's a pastor, we might use their church as the location where we conduct the interviews. And we go to multiple churches to do that, of course. When we think about the instruments that we're using, we're not merely using questionnaires, though that might be a beginning part of sorting through the population that we've chosen. And so we might conduct a pre-questionnaire just to sort through the who and the what of our variable. And then we move to an interview as the instrument of choice. And now how do we determine the validity of that instrument is we will conduct a field test to see if we have to make any adjustments to those interview questions. And then lastly, when we walk through the natural setting, we've done the key instrument, we've looked at the multiple sources that we're gathering along the way. Then we go into our analysis phase, and that's chapter 4. We collect all our data and we begin to retell what we have encountered from the research up until now. And it really is finding those patterns, is finding those themes that make up the process of your research. And so think of it as a bottom-up process rather than a top-down methodology that, as you might see in a quantitative design methodology. Now, there are some characteristics as you think about qualitative research. There's the participants meeting. How do your sample populations see it? And that's really important. It's not about you, though your personal perception is as well is important, especially if you're close to the research. So if you come from that particular field, then you need to establish personal bias. So if you're a pastor and you're wanting to research other pastors, then you need to have a statement on bias. If you're an educator, you're a teacher, and you're wanting to interview other teachers, again, it's a statement of bias. And then we provide some helpful methodologies that you can use, such as journals prior to those interviews that you may want to employ as part of your field research. Again, participant meaning, we're looking at focus on learning the meaning of the individuals that we're conducting the interviews on, to look at problems that they have, concerns, emergent themes that will be pulled out from their interviews. And this gets into the emergent design. So we're looking at changes and shifts within we think about the research. Is meaning changing from one population to another? let's say we have multiple variables that we're looking at, multiple age demographics, and one age group says it this way and another age group says it another way, and so those are emergent patterns that we would like to make note of in our research. And of course, there's the theoretical side of any to arrive at meaning, such as things we see in our literature that might motivate it. Another aspect would be political and or sociological. If we're dealing with areas of lower class or underclass, or maybe a different ethnicity may come into play, where we need to think about the personal perceptions that may emerge from those particular lenses. And of course, there's a historical. Well, you won't spend a long detailed list of the historical side, but history is always important to the literature piece to ensure, again, validity of your argument and the problem statement that may emerge from Chapter 2. Now, when we think about characteristics in qualitative research, we're also looking at interpretive inquiry. You are interpreting. You are looking at what your population is saying about the material you're covering. And in this case, the interview questions help you arrive at that meaning, and then going through the transcription, going back through the recordings that you've done while doing the research. And then you're looking at the holistic account. You're trying to develop an understandable picture. You're not twisting it. You're arriving at the meaning of what they say to be true. And again, it's what they say, and it's how you frame it within a qualitative design. So when should I use, often students will ask, when should I use qualitative methodology? Let's just walk through this. Is there a problem or issue that needs to be explored that you're curious about? Is it a church growth question? Is it a leadership question? It needs a complex, detailed understanding of the issue. You can read that there as I presented here on the PowerPoint slide. It's to understand certain perceptions, emergent patterns within what's the perceived outlook amongst leaders in the particular variable, whether it's higher ed or Christian schools or public school education. So again, you're exploring perceptions or meaning. Shared experiences. There's literary and flexible style without formal academic structures of writing. You're looking at natural setting of the participant, which is huge. So you're going there, and of course, in the age of our pandemic, we're utilizing videos to arrive at the natural setting, but nothing beats actually going to the particular location to do the field test, and not only the field test, but also the actual testing of your population through the instrument of interviews. Again, you do follow up. You may do things. Quantitative measures may not always fit within this particular field approach, and just so you know, you cannot do mixed methods at CIU. And we'll talk more about that in the weeks to come. Now, when we work through this, we're starting with the premise that you need to extend some time here in working through the field. We know that there's going to be a lot of data that you're going to have to extract. It's going to take a long process, just like in quantitative. So don't let anyone say quantitative is easy and qualitative is easy. They're both rigorous processes that have to follow its own criteria and steps that you are going to employ for safeguarding the validity of your research. So work through it, decide which methodology is going to be the best for you, and of course your mentor will help you work through that process in the end. And again, I'm here to work with you on what methodology might you employ for your possible topic. Now, when we think about the process of designing qualitative design, is we all need to arrive at any given problem. What's the problem at hand? How do we work through it? How do we examine the literature in light of the problem? What questions might we begin with? I often will encourage you to think about the how question. How does this particular variable describe the problem at hand? What are you wanting to know about? And then once you get to these RQs, these researchable questions, you explore that within the literature, and then you develop what we call is the interview questions, the valid instrument that you intend to employ. And then you go into the data analysis. You gather your data, you begin to extract the data from the tools that you are going to use, your transcriptions, you're going to audio record, and then you might even use a computerized statistical software called NNevo. NNevo looks at qualitative words and begins to arrive at meaning, also has cloud-shaped designs. It's a wonderful computer software that has emerged and changed over the years. So I would commend you to research that, and possibly you may want to use that within your field research. And then you write it up and you begin to tell us, what did you find out for chapter 4? Now, when we're thinking about phenomenological research, we're looking at phenomenon. We're looking at the meaning, or examining from a phenomenological approach, and that's even hard to say, but we're looking at how does an individual see it. It's their phenomenon, and everyone has a personal reality, a phenomenon of interest that they are connected with, and so you're going to look at the broad philosophical assumptions behind that phenomenon. And of course, Christian education, any type of theological studies, or a way that you may insert that within a leadership area or organizational change study is also helpful as well. Now, phenomenon also encompasses a biblical perspective, because phenomenon is reality, and we're all shaped by our personal stories and experiences, and so we'll look at that. So look at the participants from two broad questions. What have you experienced in terms of the phenomenon, and what contexts or situations have typically influenced or affected your experience of the phenomenon? And really, those are two good RQs that you could arrive at if you're doing phenomenological or even a case study or straight qualitative design methodology. Now, here are some things that you will face in terms of challenges as a researcher. Number one, phenomenology provides a deep understanding of the phenomenon as experienced by several individuals. Keyword several, not just one. We're looking at multiple variables there, multiple people group, or a cluster. So we're pulling that sample and we're looking at how they see it. And then number two, knowing some common experiences can be valuable, such as education or health industry, or Christian education. You can look at health personnel, even human resource, anywhere where there's people is what qualitative design is really strong in. And in terms of the human interaction, you are working with the individual, you're going on site, you're conducting the interviews, and you're spending some time there. Where quantitative is very introverted. You're not really working with people outside of maybe through a survey that you send out through emails. There's very little face-to-face interaction with a quantitative design set, whereas qualitative, you are working with an individual face-to-face focus groups. And if you like that, then the qualitative is going to be the design that you would like to go down. Phenomenology, lastly, can involve a streamlined form of data collection by, as I say here, single and multiple interviews. You can also get into what we call focus groups as well, where you bring a sample variable in and you begin to run through them with a separate interview questions that are designed differently than from maybe an interview, single interviews that you follow through with. Now, the process of designing a qualitative study, so let me just go through some 4 basic things that you need to write down. Number 1 is interviews. Number 2 is observation and documentation. And then lastly, the audiovisual materials that are used. So interviews are going to be the driver here for you as you think about qualitative design. Is coming up with a 11 to maybe even 13 interview questions that flow out of your RQs. So for each RQ, you're going to have maybe 3 to 4 interview questions that you will run everyone through. You won't divert from it. That's a straight qualitative design methodology. And so you use the interviews as the design instrument. Then number 2, you're the observer. So you're going in, you're observing, you're writing down maybe what they say. You're observing what maybe they're responding. Maybe they do this with their hands. They rub their head, and maybe there's a mental pause, and they're observing. So you're writing these things down in field notes as a way to draw back in time what that particular individual said while you were conducting the interviews. And of course, there are other documents. We talk about documents in Chapter 2. What does the literature say? And that also informs your validity. And then lastly, audiovisual materials may also be used, such as transcriptions, audio recording of your interviews, and how you safeguard the integrity of your research. And then lastly, you think about the data collected from multiple sources. You're looking at what the literature says, Chapter 2, and then you're looking at what the interviews, the information from the interviews have obtained. You have obtained some type of information from the interviews. Now you're going to have to then interpret it and collect it. Lastly, when we think about working through the designing of the qualitative, it is a little bit awkward at times because you're asking for personal information. So you need to be sensitive to that. You also need to think about the slow process of looking at words and expressing that out in Chapter 4. You're also looking at consent form that needs to be given to the participant. Confidentiality and anonymity is a primary focus that needs to, you need to think through the coding. How will you code the participants that you are interviewing to ensure that they are not violated in terms of anonymity? And so, again, think through that process and those steps. When we think about the collecting from multiple data, adequately summarizing the data, and spending adequate time in the field, these all become important parts of the qualitative design methodology. And so we just would encourage you to think through, how will I collect my data? From where is this source coming from? How am I going to pick my population? Am I getting that from a database? Am I getting that from inventory collected on a website? Again, know that these things will evolve and they will change, and the multiple realities that come from your qualitative design will come into focus. And so you will need to be thinking about that data collection in terms of where I'm going to store it, how am I going to analyze it, and what might the participants say as I think through the process. You're going to need to write clearly, and you need to gauge all the full ideas to the measure that they say. You're going to have to code it in a certain way that some data may not actually come into your research and it needs to be thrown out because you're only looking at the most important quality of the interviews as you look at it. And of course, all research needs to be ethical. We've touched on that already. I won't spend a lot of time here thinking through that, but just know that you need to think ethically in regards to the qualitative design methodology. Now, Maxwell provides 9 arguments that are helpful here for designing your qualitative proposal. Think of it in terms of, I want to better understand a phenomenon or an emergent theme that is on maybe a book, or idea was raised in one of your books that you're reading, and so you have a hunch, and so you want to test that within a sample population. We know little about this information. Nothing has been written about this particular topic or studied in this particular field, and so I propose to study this particular topic. Now realize you can't use the word I in your research, but definitely you can begin thinking through that process right now. Number 4, you're thinking about the setting and the participants that will make up your study. Where are you going to start? Who? Is it in your backyard? Can you use your immediate geographical location to start your study? Or does it need to be broader than that? and hopefully your mentor will guide you in this class, and other classes will serve to encourage you toward that methodology. Number 5, the methods I plan to use will provide the following details to the questions that I'm going to express out. Number 6, analysis will generate answers to these questions. What additional questions might emerge from the questions you've already established? And by the way, that happens. And it also serves as in chapter 5, that other people can pick up some of the research that you initialized in your dissertation. Maybe someone else could say, hey, I'm going to study this group in a different way, take it from you, and you provided the baseline for that. Number 7, the findings will be validated by ... How will you validate your instrument to make sure that it's valid? You follow the steps. And again, your limitations and your delimitations to your study are going to be important. How will how will you follow through your methodology from point A to point Z through the way you write, all the way down to the day you show up for that interview is going to be important part of the process. And then as you think about the study, it poses no serious ethical problems. You're not violating anyone's anonymity. They have consented to the interview. And as you think about transcription, you may even want to do what's called member checking. You bring the transcription back to them to see if they are okay with how the interview went. And so they look at the transcription and say, yes, this is what I said, I'm good to go. And that allows you to move forward with that participant in your interview. And then lastly, you're looking at preliminary results. You're putting into practical written and narrative expression what each of the participants said, and you might come back with key ideas, key phrases, quotes from the interviews that help answer what the interview questions set out to do. Okay, and so that's what Maxwell provides. Well, we have provided you, or I have at least given you what a qualitative approach is and how might you frame that as you move forward. And in the weeks to come, we'll continue to work through it. We'll also provide how do you look at a sample population, where might you pull that from, and we'll try to work through that as we consider data and how best to analyze data for a qualitative design methodology.